Thanks, guys. That was a great prayer. Do I even need to talk? Pretty much summarise what I'm about to say. I'll give you a little sneak behind the curtain. When we're preparing our kind of sermon planning for the year, we kind of put things out, and what happens is I kind of attach passages to particular kind of messages, and you do these things, you do these mini sermons in your head. You kind of look at a text briefly, and you're like, "Yep, there's something there. That's good. Yep, no worries." And so you got kind of like 100 mini sermons kind of sitting in your brain, but then you trust that that is sitting there, and then you come back to it closer to the date, and you're like, "Okay, ready to go." Well, this week I had a look at the text that I'd put down for myself. I'm like, "Gavin, what were you thinking? What were you thinking? This is not good. This is incredibly frustrating. It's very annoying, in fact. I mean, there's some great stuff in the story of Jacob, but why did you pick this particular text for this particular point?" And the reason it's so frustrating, I think, is partly to do with the fact that right now in my life, I've got Davey, my 2-year-old, who at present we're navigating this idea, 4-year-old, why did I say 2-year-old? My second son, who's 4 years old, it's been a long day, and we're navigating at this point in time this idea that it's okay to watch this movie because the good guys will win in the end, right? Okay, so that, that sense of kind of going, the tension that builds up some anxiety, that particularly when we were younger we used to experience. You need a bit of conflict, you need a bit of resistance, right, in order for the story to be interesting. But right now, as a 4-year-old, he is just nervous when the bad guy maybe looks like he's getting ahead, those kind of moments. And so I feel like for him, I need to provide that reassurance. It's like, it's okay, because don't worry, the good guy always wins, right? Now, we know that there's various movies where the good guys don't win, but in terms of what he's going to be exposed to, the good guy is always going to win. Or at the very least, the bad guy will have a little transformative moment, where suddenly he's a little bit more humble, or he learnt a lesson or something like that, And so I'm in this headspace where it's like the good guy should win, but they should also have put in the effort to win, and the bad guy's going to go through this process, and they're going to be refined. At least there's kind of a journey that each of these characters goes on to get to that end point. And then I got to this text, and man, like, it's super frustrating. Because Jacob, right, he has very little redemptive quality. I just got to be honest, he has very little redemptive quality. I mean, up to this point in time, in terms of the story of Jacob, the thing that he's had to offer us is he has what we call chutzpah, which means he wants it, right? He wants the blessing, he wants the authority, he wants it more so than Esau did, right, his brother. But at the same time, with that chutzpah, with that wanting it, he's basically like, I'll use whatever means necessary. So there's no kind of ethical or spiritual framework around that chutzpah. He just wants it. And as we work through this text, we're actually not going to see much character development in him, right? And so I want to put this out here from the get-go. It's very important to understand as we work through this text, Jacob is not an example for us to imitate. And I think this is probably one of the most frustrating parts of the story. It's because usually you can at least, again, through a character and their interactions with God or the interactions through their circumstances, you can see some sort of character growth. You see something kind of developing in them. And yet, at least at this point, we're not going to see that yet. And the tragedy is that Jacob didn't need to live this way. And as a result of his way of going about life, this propensity toward deception, he's going to have to go through a whole lot of deception toward himself. He's going to go through this shrewdness. He's going to go through this tricking because of how he's chosen to live his life. And so over this sermon, what we're going to see is we're going to see these massive patterns of dysfunction, these incredibly broken kind of false starts that nonetheless God is going to continue to work through. God's basically going to say, I'm going to be with you, I'm going to help you get where you're going, but this isn't going to be an easy road. Because there's part of Jacob that, at least when we see in the biblical narrative, that he's never going to be able to overcome. And yet God is going to work through it regardless God is frustratingly faithful in this story. And it's weird because it kind of annoys me. I know it shouldn't annoy me, but it kind of does annoy me, right? Because part of me, I want it there to be some kind of payoff. I want there to be like a fairness to this situation. Of course, fair, for all of us means that, when I'm good, I get good things, and when I'm bad, I don't get bad things. Super fair, right? But there's a sense of I'm like, come on. Like, where is this thread that I can cling to say, well, God was doing that for Jacob because at least he learnt nothing. Just absolutely nothing. And yet God was still there. And this is the point, I think, of this text. From the very outset of Genesis and the narrative of creation and all the way through, God is forever a God of grace. Grace didn't start just when Jesus showed up, right? God has always been this God of grace who knows what he's working with and will work with broken people and broken situations and be faithful nonetheless. And tonight, through the lens of Jacob, I would invite us to identify the various broken places that we find ourselves. It may not be exactly the story of Jacob, but all of us are going to have these kind of broken places within our lives where God chooses to remain faithful nonetheless. Maybe it is that we have to hear this because we have blind spots in our own life that God has to kind of work through, that others see but maybe we don't. Maybe we have history and regrets about what happened in the past that are maybe going to continue to rear their ugly heads, and we've got to be like, oh man, I know that brokenness is a part of my journey. There's going to be times when we are not as smart as we think we are. We're trying to leverage God. We're trying to make him do what we want him to do. And there's these risk in these moments, whether they be regret and history or blind spots or not being as smart as we think we are. When we ourselves declare, when I am in this place, in this circumstance, suffering the consequence of this particular action, God isn't with me. That's a temptation. To be like, that area God isn't in. And yet what we're going to see in Jacob's story is the complete opposite to this, is that God is faithful nonetheless. So I'm going to give a bit of backstory to where this where we're going to enter into this story. So here we have in Genesis 27, just to find out where Jacob is up to in his story. It says, Esau, who's Jacob's brother, held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. Now remember, Jacob had deceived Esau and deceived Isaac into giving him this blessing. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. When Rebekah was told what her older son Esau had said, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, your brother Esau is planning to avenge himself by killing you. Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him for a while until your brother's fury subsides. When your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him, I'll send word for you to come back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day? And so Jacob, being Rebekah's favourite, that was a whole other situation going on. She's like, this is not good. I don't want both of you to die. I'm going to, you flee. Run, okay? Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from the Hittite women like these, my life will be not worth living. So Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him, and he commanded him, do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Paddan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself from there, from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. So this is the backstory. So in summary, Esau wanted to kill Jacob. Rebekah makes this kind of manipulative excuse. She's like, she just wants him to flee. She just doesn't want him to die. And so, but to Isaac, she's just like, oh, it's these Hittite women. They're like, my life would not be worth living if Jacob marries one of these. So she's like, it's completely unnecessary, but so much a part of the story of the family is this deception. And so she makes up this excuse, and so Isaac says, yep, okay, no worries. So he blesses him with the intention that hopefully God will bless Jacob in order to be fruitful and increase your numbers to become a community of peoples. And so the important thing to understand is as we pick up this story, this journey toward Paddan Aram is not an honourable journey. This is not Jacob going, okay, I want to follow the way of God, so I'm going to pursue his calling. I know that my grandfather was given this blessing that I'll be blessed in order to be a blessing to the nations, and now I'm going to pursue that because I got the blessing by deceptive means, but at least now I'm going to go on the right path. No. This guy was fleeing for his life under a false pretense. Okay? And so that's where we pick up this story in Genesis 29. Then Jacob continued on his journey. This is actually after that message I spoke about him kind of meeting God with the stairway in a dream. Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples, where he saw a well in the open country, with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Now, it feels like a bizarre level of detail in terms of like this particular story. But the detail is there for a very good reason. And it feels a little bit innocent, but particularly this line, there he saw a well in the open country. It actually speaks to a level of desperation and discomfort that Jacob was experiencing in that moment. If you recall the previous stories, and I don't necessarily expect you to, but if you recall the previous stories, that phrase, the open country, has already come up one time before. And that was when it was described the difference between the 2 brothers in Genesis 25, where it said the boys grew up and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. So you've got this kind of label and this kind of direction and this level of comfort that was associated with each of these 2 brothers. And suddenly Jacob finds himself on the run from a brother with murderous intent, and he gets to this place, and what does he see? He sees a well in the open country. And this indicates to us that this wasn't his type of territory. Jacob's life was still under threat. Jacob still knows the consequences of his actions, and he is being reminded of them again and again. He's like, here we go again. Here I am. I'm still under threat. I'm not in this place of comfort. And I'm reminded of my deception. I'm reminded of the cost of my previous actions toward my brother. And you can see, even in this simple reference, that Jacob himself was carrying this kind of painful history. Every time he sees that well in the open country, he's reminded that this is not my place of comfort. There's baggage attached. And so for Jacob, I think it's important for us to be reminded that each of us, depending upon our history and the things that we've gone through, there's going to be times where we are reminded of our history and the regrets associated with that history. And sometimes it can happen in the most unexpected ways. Someone will have a turn of phrase, they'll just say something, and suddenly you're reminded of something that happened way back then, and you're like, oh, why does that sting? Why does that sting? It's just a well in the open country. I mean, why does that hurt so much? Because it's not about the well. It's about the safety and the space that is lacking there, because suddenly I'm reminded that I haven't pursued the honourable path at all times. And again, this is just simply a point of identification for us with Jacob's story, recognising that there's going to be times when we see open wells or wells in open countries in our own life. What am I going to do in that moment? Am I going to keep moving on? Am I going to acknowledge that? And where is God in the midst of this history and regret? Well, we're going to see how God responds in this moment. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran." Oh, that's convenient. they replied. He said, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said. "Oh, and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." Like it almost seems too providential, right? And so from this place of like, oh, pain, regret, well in the open country, what am I carrying? Suddenly we see God provides. This was the very thing that he needed to remind him that the story wasn't over. Now, whether he's going to embrace that truth and have it reflect in his actions, that's a whole other story. But this was definitely a reminder that even in the midst of that pain and history and regret, in that unsafe space that I was, God chose to provide. And this is what I want us to take away from just this little first encounter. A faithful God won't waste the uncomfortable spaces. Like the nature of God is he will not waste those uncomfortable spaces. If they're uncomfortable for a reason, right? God wants to not just kind of let us get away with a free pass. There's like a reason for that. And sometimes we need to work out, why is that triggering for me? But nevertheless, a faithful God is going to show up and seek to remind us that there are other truths he wants us to hear as well. The fact that God provided didn't make Jacob less deceptive, nor did his actions, were they in any way, justified. And yet God was going to use that moment to twist that discomfort into something that Jacob needed to hear. I wonder if there are uncomfortable places in your life where maybe you've been tempted to say, God's not here. And yet God wants to demonstrate his provision in spite of that regret. Let's continue. We're going to jump forward a little bit. Laban comes out to meet Jacob, and he says to him, brings him into his household, and he says to him, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." We're going to jump forward a little bit. Now, what happens from here is Laban is a very deceptive person. Jacob meets his match, right? Now, Jacob is a deceiver. Laban, even in the Jewish kind of history, is known as the worst of the worst in terms of deception. They always want to stand up for Jacob. But something terrible happens. Now, we need to obviously just take a moment to recognise the context of this day, women being treated as property and all this kind of stuff. Let's acknowledge that this is contextually driven. But nevertheless, there is drama that occurs. Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when the evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week and we'll give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." Now, I'm not going to go into all the detail of contextual here and appropriateness and inappropriateness. You can do that in your own time. But nevertheless, what we see here is another point of pain and frustration, and because of Jacob's actions and interactions with family members, he found himself on the loser side of this deception, so to speak. He meets Laban, this fellow manipulator and deceiver. And what's interesting is I just kind of wonder, in meeting Laban and having these interactions over many, many years, how much Jacob saw himself in Laban. You know that thing where you kind of, sometimes when you struggle with a characteristic of someone, it's because you know it's actually a part of you? Oh man, that must have been tough work for Jacob. Being like, what have you done to me? Like this has echoes of Esau, right? What have you done? Why have you deceived me? Well, man, I mean, talk about the collateral damage from this thing, by the way. So selfish. What have you done to me? Oh, come on, man. But there's this sense in which he suddenly has this blind spot to his own deception. And then the women and ultimately the children and the servants and even Jacob in time become these kind of pawns in this dysfunctional system of favourites and exchange. That's what this is going to turn into. It's terrible. You read through this text and everyone's just manipulating everyone, right? No one is being honoured and all the people are being marginalised and the vulnerable and everyone is, it's just an absolute mess. Now, interestingly, later biblical law in Leviticus chapter 18 forbids a man from being married to two sisters simultaneously. And this story is most likely why. Now, it's also a good thing in terms of dating our text because they wouldn't have Jacob doing this if it was against Torah law, had the Torah law come first. But nevertheless, this is something for us to consider. Sometimes we find ourselves having either contributed to the system or simply being a victim of a system of dysfunction, where suddenly there are like blind spots or patterns of behaviour where we get caught up in our own traps. And this is what Jacob has done. And just because God is faithful, by the way, it doesn't mean that we are immune from consequence. And it doesn't mean that there's not going to be collateral damage. There's so much collateral damage from this. And yet, the frustratingly faithful God still acts and still responds. Note this. Oh, and Jacob did so. He finished his week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. This is a setup, right? So dysfunctional. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." So she named him Simeon. And this is going to continue. She's going to have at least 2 more kids straight after that. If you try to turn this story into theology, you're going to get into trouble. I just want to put that out there. But what we do see in this text is that in spite of the dysfunction and the contribution that Jacob's made to this absolute mess, God is still hearing and seeing the vulnerable. God is still hearing and seeing the vulnerable. In this case, it was Leah. And there's going to be times when, again, we either contribute or get caught up in systems, and it's so important to remember that even in that space, and we might be suffering the consequence of that, and that might be right that we suffer the consequence of that, and yet the faithful God will not allow our actions to shift his gaze from the vulnerable. You see, a faithful God continues to take responsibility even when we don't. The Lord saw that Leah was not loved and he actioned something on her behalf. Sometimes we have wounds that are triggered. Sometimes we create systems of destruction and damage. This doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want. It's simply saying that God is God. Like I said, tough text. I want to look at one more example. In Genesis 30, after Rachel gave birth to Joseph, this is right at the end of all the birthings of wives and assistants, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I'll be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." Oh, it's so messy. Like, he learned by divination? Like, come on. He added, "Name your wages and I will pay them." I'm going to kind of summarize what happens next. So Jacob makes this negotiation with Laban that in terms of the sheep, that Laban will be able to keep the pure black and pure white sheep, and he will take the striped, spotted, or speckled sheep. And Laban ends up taking basically all the purebred kind of away from Jacob in the hope that he won't be able to essentially breed these speckled sheep. It's all very deceptive. However, Jacob took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them. If you're confused by this, that's okay. You're supposed to be. By peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that was streaked, speckled, or spotted. Now, Jacob essentially instituted some sort of like folklore medicine. I've heard people try to justify this as actually legit. It's not. There's no legitimacy to this breeding process. Right? He instituted this kind of folklore medicine type deal through the breeding process, taking these fresh cut branches to essentially try and create and breed the sheep in such a way that they were streaked, speckled, or spotted. It doesn't work. I just want to make that clear. Scientifically, it doesn't work that way. What we see here is an attempt by Jacob to essentially out-manipulate Laban, or you could say, force God's hand. I'm going to reveal why that is in just a little while. But I think that this is an interesting question as we again consider our kind of role in our story. You know, have we ever tried to tip the scales in our favour? Interestingly, the way that this is described, it isn't just this guy like being really smart or even being deceptive. What this was actually a lack of faith on Jacob's part. And the reason we know this is because a little bit later on we see him say this. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He had multiplied his flocks by this point in time. He said to them, "I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, that your father has cheated me by changing wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me." So he makes this statement of kind of going like, you know, whatever Laban was doing, God was in control of this situation, even though he'd been doing this bizarre folklore medicine type deal. He continues, "In breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, 'Jacob, here I am,' I answered. And he said, 'Look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land.'" See, this is the fascinating thing. It's like God had sent an angel, and it's just bizarre how Jacob kind of recalls this, and I know it's easy to kind of get lost in all the speckled, spotted, streaked kind of sheep talk. But essentially what God had said to him was, "I see the injustice that Laban is committing against you." And Jacob himself testifies that whatever the wages are that Laban keeps on changing, God has aligned his providence so that it would produce favourably for Jacob. And yet here he is carving up sticks and putting them in water troughs. It's something that doesn't even work. But he just chose to do it anyway, right? And so this is why it isn't just a thing, it's a lack of faith, right? It's like God already said he was going to deliver, and there you are trying to tip the scales in your favour. You know, whatever superstitious or nonsensical ideas behind Jacob's placement of branches in the troughs, it was God who was the one who increased the speckled sheep and goats. All of this kind of extra work of Jacob had been for naught. Jacob's attempts to increase his flock were actually unnecessary because God had already determined to enrich him. And so God graciously worked, not because of Jacob's streaked branches, but in spite of them. A faithful God can use our ignorance or work around it. A faithful God can use our ignorance or work around it. There's always a temptation in this message. I hear in this message, it's like God's going to be faithful anyway. It doesn't excuse us from our behaviors. Again, Jacob didn't have to live this way, right? God was really clear. It's just like, I'm going to bless you, but it's going to be hard. And Jacob suffered. He worked hard, especially for a guy who liked to stay indoors. And yet, there was God saying, I'm going to continue to push my mission forward even through these broken means, broken circumstances, broken people, even to the person who apparently is learning nothing. I'm not going to allow him to prevent me from achieving what I want to achieve. Again, this is a hard story to preach on. But there's going to be times for each of us where we have history and regrets that will continue to rear their heads. And there's going to be flaws and blind spots that others see and maybe we don't. And there's going to be times when we're just not as smart as we think we are. And again, there's always a risk that in these moments we declare, when I'm in these places, God isn't with me. Or when I've been in these places, God wasn't with me then. And yet, what we see in Jacob's story is the God who is faithful regardless. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul writes to his disciple and he says, this saying is trustworthy. If we have died with him, being Jesus, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. We, like Jacob, all have a choice with how to live. God gives us opportunities to thrive with the responsibility attached to that. We can do the sacrificial love thing. We can endure so we can live and reign. God gives us the freedom to reject his way with the consequences attached to this as well. If we deny him, he'll also deny us. But with our painful histories, our blind spots and our ignorance, even when we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. God is faithful anyway. We take a moment to pray. God, messy, messy story. But you know what you're working with. And God, thank you for your invitation into your way and your kingdom. Thank you for that grace by which you invite us to truly experience a life that you created us to live, but we know we're not always going to hit that. We're not always going to pursue that. It's not going to be always our experience. And God, when we drop the ball, I want to thank you that you continue to pursue us. We sang that song, Reckless Love, before. God, that's reckless. That's frustratingly faithful. And so, God, we take a moment to consider our story. Maybe those lessons that we just haven't learnt yet. Those areas we want to get our attention and yet our hearts are hard. Thank you that you don't have to press pause on your mission because of our hard hearts. And yet, God, we want to be with you. We don't just want access to your mission. We want to live it out with you. And so may we take encouragement from you, the God who provides, and the God who hears the vulnerable, and the God who works in spite or around our ignorance. And once again, fall into your grace. If there's areas, God, where we need to repent, we need to say, yeah, God, I messed up. Thank you that you meet us in those places and you're ready to extend forgiveness and you're ready to extend that invitation once again to participate in your way with arms open wide. May we do the work. Amen.